Well, hello. Today is Monday, February the 17th, and we did not have a busy day up on Capitol Hill as it is President's Day. And so there was no meeting of the legislature. However, there were still some new bills that did come out and also some pending bills. But I wanted to take a moment today to look more in depth at this particular holiday that we're celebrating, which is, of course, President's Day. As many of us are probably aware, President's Day was originally set up in recognition of George Washington's birthday. And so when you think about George Washington, is he potentially the most famous American of all time? My opinion of George Washington, and one that I would like to try to portray today, is that George Washington was actually an action hero. He was born, as we know, on February 22nd, 1732. But was he really? We actually know that George Washington was born in Virginia on February 11th, 1731, and according to the then used Julian calendar. And so then it was in 1752, however, that Britain and all of its colonies adopted the Gregorian calendar, which moved Washington's birthday a year and 11 days to February 22nd, 1732. So maybe that's one thing that we all are learning today. From there, long before Congress decided that this was a federal holiday, the centennial of Washington's birth actually prompted a lot of festivities, and nationally, and Congress actually established a joint committee to arrange for the occasion of celebrating the 100th anniversary of Washington's birth. It was then at the recommendation of the committee chaired by Henry Clay of the Senate and Philemon Thomas of the House that Congress adjourned on February 22nd, 1832 out of respect for Washington's memory and in commemoration of his birth. And that would be the first time that we actually have the United States of America and its legislation celebrating his birth. This then was prompted by a memorial from the mayor and other citizens in Philadelphia, the House, the Senate. They all commemorated the 130th anniversary of Washington's birth, and they did this by reading aloud his most famous address, his farewell address. So why is it that we don't celebrate Washington's birth on his actual birthday? Well, that was actually brought to us by the Uniform Federal Holiday Acts of 1971. Gotta love the government. Well, what was the point here? Well, what they were doing is that its observance can actually happen between February 15th all the way up to the 21st. And one of the provisions for this act that changed the observance of Washington's birthday from February 22nd to the third Monday in February, which is a little strange when you think about it, because ironically, that actually guarantees that we will never celebrate on Washington's actual birthday because it can't fall later than February 21st. So when you think about Washington, for most of us, you probably immediately think about the pocket Constitution, which has Washington's face on it. I know that's for me. Other of us, we may think of the $1 bill that has Washington's face on it, which I did some research on that, and some indicate that we may actually be printing close to 19 million of those bills with Washington's face on it. And that was actually that very famous Gilbert Stuart painting of 1796. And this was when Washington was 64 years old that we got that painting. And it was almost 50 years that Washington had been involved in service for his country when that painting was actually done. And so for a lot of us, Washington seems a little bit elusive, and some of that may be, look at the Washington Monument. I mean, it's just this enormous slab of stone, versus if you look at the Jefferson and Lincoln memorials, we have statues of them as well as their words and things that we can lead. So let's look for a moment at Washington and who he was. So we know that he was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army for 8 years. He was basically the head of state. When he got done with that, he wanted to go back to his farm and his family. He was then the president of the 1787 convention, which eventually gave us our current Constitution. And then he was the first president, as we all know, for 8 years. But let's back up, because at the start of this, I said that Washington is actually an action hero. And if I had to choose who he reminds me a little bit of, because I'm a Star Wars fan, he reminds me a lot of Luke Skywalker. And look at this, right? So in 1754, this was when Washington was only 22 years of age. And just like that colonial Luke Skywalker, he went to hold a plot of land against the French. And during this, as Washington and his men were going out, this big ambush ensued. And it was very short, it was very bloody, and Washington was victorious through this. And afterwards, he wrote this particular letter to his brother where he stated, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound." And so Washington really started to come alive during battles. And this particular event sparked the 7-year French and Indian War. And it was a British statesman, his name was Horace Walpole, that later said it was a volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods that set the world on fire. Of course, that young person being George Washington. So then fast forward just 1 year, and so now we're at 1755. And this is where Washington really got his name. And this was at the battle, and I'm probably going to slaughter this, of Monongahela, French and Indian battle. And at this point, he is an aide to the commander-in-chief of the British Army. And that was General Edward Braddock. And so Braddock was sent specifically to defend the Ohio country. And he had planned to go up and attack the Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And during this, Washington had advised him, we got to do this war a little bit different than the way that you fight over in Europe. We need to travel light, and we need to be able to move quickly from place to place. Well, General Braddock didn't want to hear any of that, so they traveled with all of their heavy gear. And so from there, it was July of 1755 that 1,300 British and militia were marching, and then on July 9th, there was the French were spotted. And a lot of confusion set in. The French were in the trees. They also had Indians with them during this particular battle. And during this, a lot of confusion set in, and Indians are scalping people, and people are dying. It's an extremely bloody battle. And during this time, the General Braddock actually is shot in the lung and is wounded in battle. And this is when Washington came alive. And Washington jumped on his horse, and he started riding back and forth for hours. And during this, he was actually able to get all of his people reorganized, and he got them situated. And he had actually his first horse got shot out from under him. He jumped on a second horse, and the second horse got shot out from under him. When I got done with this is the very famous story where he actually had 4 bullet holes through his apparel, through his clothing, but not one bullet had struck him. Now, even though half of the British had fallen, and there would have been a lot more without the help of Washington, Braddock then didn't give him the night off. He ordered Washington to ride 40 miles to sequester another leader to come out. And so this is where the legend of Washington was born. And this is really where the indomitable courage, even amongst the threat of death, came alive for President Washington. It was also one where so many people said that it was actually Providence that preserved him. And years later, there was a chief from this battle who saw him, and he told Washington that he had ordered his men to shoot him, but they could not hit him. And then the chief said this to Washington. I want to quote this. He said, "He will become the chief of nations, and people not yet born would hail him as the chief of a mighty empire." And he told this to him only a few years prior to the American Revolution. And an amazing book that I would really recommend, it's called Washington Alive by Ron Chernow, that goes through all of this and helps to substantiate and pull apart what is fact and what is fiction, especially as it relates to Washington. The last story I want to share is one of my favorite, and this is in 1776. And now Washington is 44 years old. He's the leader of our Continental Army, and he's been the leader of the Army for about a year and a half, which again, we got to wind up a moment, I'm sorry. 2 months in to the battles, after the Declaration of Independence, the British had completely embarrassed and defeated the colonials. And Washington had thrown down his hat after one of the defeats and actually declared, and I quote, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" And so 3,000 men had been killed, a lot of munitions had been lost, and so Washington and his men had been really on the retreat since there. The other thing that was happening here that made it even worse is that when people signed up for the colonial battle and to be a part of the colonial army, they had signed up for a 1-year enrollment, and that was going to be ending very soon. And so Washington was very desperate. In fact, he's on record as stating, "I am weary even unto death." And so he was basically saying that if we didn't get moving, if we didn't find a way to get something happening, that the Americans were facing defeat. And so this is when he decided to take action. And the date is December 25th of 1776. Leave it to the Americans on Christmas Eve to cross the Delaware at what became known as the Battle of Trenton. And for any of you that are very interested in learning more about this, a very interesting and fun thing that we as a family participate in is something called Patriot Camp, where we actually get to enact this out. And one of the things that my wife and I have done is we go with a pool and fill it with ice and let the kids stand in that as if they're experiencing the very cold river, and drag sleds around and have to march up hills and overcome obstacles, and then of course run down to where the Hessians are positioned in Trenton, as it were, and this battle ensues. So during this crisis, it was actually Thomas Paine that only a couple days before had written this, and let me quote, he said, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." And I'll put a link down below where you can read all of this. It's an amazing thing. So then the Americans sneak into Trenton at night. They had left, everything else behind. They cross this amazingly frigid river. They do so with very skilled boatmen who get everybody across. Took much longer than Washington wanted. He was very frustrated by that, but nobody died. The Battle of Trenton was actually over in about an hour. And during that, not only were they victorious, but not one person died, which again really fed back to the prior fights and battles that Washington was in where he had not been injured. And now the sentiment was, has this mantle passed to his men for protection? After that, the good news is they got munitions, they got themselves back together, but the battle wasn't over because we know that there was another crisis pending and additional British were coming. And so what happened here is that the Americans then snuck away from Trenton at night. They left their fires burning. They had some there banging pitchforks and things to allow the British to think they're probably still there. Meantime, our Luke Skywalker, or George Washington, had snuck his entire army and marched them all the way to Princeton. And when they got there, another great battle ensued, wherein during this battle, the smoke became so much from all of the gunfighter and powder going off that most of the men had feared that Washington had fallen. As the smoke started to clear, Washington again appears on his horse and is very courageous in stating very clearly, "We have a great fox hunt." And so he was reinvigorated in this passion that he found and this invigoration that he found in defending America from all foes. It was then Frederick the Great who left this amazing quote about Washington when he said, "The achievements of Washington and his little band of compatriots from the 25th of December to the 4th of January were the most brilliant of any recorded in the annals of military achievements." So my hope is that this has shed just a little more light on who Washington is. What an amazing opportunity we have this President's Day, not to only remember Washington, but all 45 of our great presidents and those stories that we can share about them. I wanted to share this about Washington, where of course this holiday was started with him. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll have a busy day up on the Hill tomorrow. Thank you.